Hello guys, I'm back with another guide. Today I want to talk about strategy and tactics in Age of Empires 4. So I'm trying to answer a question: how do you win in Age of Empires? So what exactly affects your win or loss probability? And I think there are three main components that affect it. First of all, it's strategy, which is simply your game plan. It is when exactly you want to push, how do you want to develop, and how do you want to eventually win this game. Second is tactics. Tactics is simply your situational responses to what your opponent is doing. For example, you want to counter horseman raids, you want to counter enemy English king, you want to transition to foot. So tactics are simply different ways of doing this. Last component is micro difference, which is simply how quickly and how efficiently do you control your units or your economy. And I think that strategy and tactics are by far the most important in this game. So micro and macro are also important. You also should have at least some level of control over units. You should not forget to make villages, for example. But once you have some basic skills, it all becomes about strategy and tactics in Age of Empires. Alright, so I'm making some assumptions in this guide. First of all, I'm only talking about land maps 1 versus 1. Second is I assume that players have at least some level of micro and macro, so don't forget to make villagers, make country units, try not to lose siege. Yes, it's just things like this. I'm also talking only about general strategies and tactics, so I'm not discussing strategies and tactics that are specific to some civilizations. Like for example, Malians can try to transition into cows or make some pit mines, and other civilizations cannot do this, so I'm not discussing this in this guide. Last one is I'm assuming that players are not too far apart in skill level. So it's not the case that one player can play, for example, mass archer rush from one town center every game and win simply because he is much better at micro. Yeah, here I'm assuming that players are of equal skill, in which case strategy and tactics will be very important. First, I want to give some examples of how strategy and tactics might lose or win you the game. In this example we can see Ottoman who plays 2 town centers, which is kind of a slow strategy, right? And he's playing this against Holy Roman Empire who plays Burgrave fast castle. We can see that it's very easy for HRE to produce some towns for Burgrave and just try to destroy Ottoman, while he's still in H2 without any good answer to my attempts. So this would be an example of strategic disadvantage for Ottoman player. Second is when English player tries to rush in feudal age against Japanese who's playing fast castle. It can be very bad for English player because for a Japanese player it's easy to put up some towers, maybe research some emplacements there, maybe fortify this tower, then just get to next stage, make a stable, make floating gate, so his stable works like 3 stables, and just make a lot of knights. And it becomes a very difficult strategic position for English player, because you need to deal with knights, you need to protect yourself from raids, and your economy is not great at this point. So some examples of tactical disadvantages is when you're playing spearmen plus crossbowmen against full archers. So spearmen and crossbowmen usually is a good composition because it's fairly universal, but if your opponent is playing a lot of archers, it can be very weak. You're losing your expensive units to cheap archers. Second disadvantage is when you're trying to collect unsafe food source against Delhi. In this example, you can see French player just started to collect this deer pack, put up one tower, then 10 Gaza raiders can just arrive, burn this tower. If you cannot protect it, if you don't have palisades, if you don't have any spearmen, then these villagers will die, and this is a tactical mistake. So last example I want to show is example of skill difference. So here we can see that both players have some military, have some similar compositions, so it's not clear who would win this fight. But we also can see that red player has 2 mangonels and some springles, and that pink is losing springle fight. And maybe it doesn't just have a lot of springles. So this would be example of skill disadvantage, because pink player should not be fighting this, he should not be losing springles, but now he loses a springled and mangonels are going to crush these crossbows, unless he steps back. So we can see just in general that strategy and tactics they matter, and sometimes skill also matters. Okay, first I want to talk about strategy. I divide strategies in different components, 3 components. It's economy, military and defense. So again, just to reiterate, a strategy is a general plan of winning the game. It's not just a sequence of actions. So it's not just I play 2 town centers, then I make 2 knights, then I maybe go castle. It's more difficult, it's more complicated. It's just a plan of how and when are you going to win, of how and when are you going to press your advantage. For example, maybe you're not sure when exactly are you going to win with Malians. You just know that you want to make some cows, make some pit mines, situationally make some units, then go h3, then make some sofas maybe and attack. So you don't know what composition exactly will you be using, at which minute do you want to all in, but you know your general plan of actions and you know that in general you want to attack after you hit castle age. Yeah, so 3 dynamic components we are talking about here, so it's economy, military and defense. Economy is simply how strong your economic output right now is. Military is how big is your capacity for aggression, so this is how big your military is and how easy it is to attack. And the last one is defense. Defense is a bit more complicated, but basically it's just how easy it is to defend your economy and how easy it is to control it. So I want to start by showing this plot. I'll be using the strategy plots just to illustrate some strategy component dynamics. Here we can see strategy plot for HRE. So here I assume that HRE is playing fast h3 into fast h4. First let's look at economy component, it's a blue line. We can see that blue line will continue to grow throughout the game. It grows a little bit more quickly after feudal age, because Aachen age will boost it. Then it gets a small boost because of relics. Actually, it's not a small boost, yeah, it's a significant boost. But HRE is expecting to pick up some relics, at least 2, maybe 3 relics, which will give it economic boost. Then, after it hits Imperial, it just starts to develop very rapidly, because of Swabia. Also, we have a military graph. In this example, HRE is not planning to produce any units before Castle Age. It plans to make some units, maybe some knights, maybe some spearmen in Castle Age. Then it will also pause until Imperial, and after it hit Imperial, after it stabilized, it will produce a lot of units. Last graph is defense component. Defense starts out at some level, because town center gives you some protection, right? You can collect sheep under it, you can maybe farm under it, your food line is also protected. In this example, h3 player is planning to place a tower in feudal age, to protect his gold mine, to protect maybe his farms somewhat. Then defense will stay at the same level, because h3 player is not going to become any more exposed. But he will not going to become any more protected either, right? Because he will most likely make farms under his Aachen chapel. And then, after we are in Imperial, he will add some towers, some cannon emplacements and place relics inside. Maybe he might do it before, but let's assume he does it in Imperial. So defense grows very quickly. It becomes extremely difficult to attack h3 player because of towers and because of emergency repairs. Also because h3 player doesn't need to escape his base for gold, because of relics. So, using this plot, we can see that a very strong point for HRE is right after Imperial, right after placing towers, after military production, but also it has some weak points. For example, here it doesn't have a lot of military, maybe it doesn't have so much defense. You might try to attack it at this point. Maybe at some point during feudal, if gold mine is really exposed, if woodline is exposed, you might try tower rushing or being very aggressive here. So it depends on your matchup, it depends on situation, but we can see some weak points. By the way, I'm using these plots just to illustrate what weak and strong points a civilization or a strategy has. So you don't have like to fully visualize this plot in your head, right? You just need to understand in general when are strong and weak points for each civilization, and what are main transitions. So I'll start by discussing different strategy openings. There are 4 general openings: 1 town center fast castle, 1 town center aggression, 2 town center fast castle and 2 town center aggression. And there doesn't exist any general rule of thumb that you can use, like you should always play 1 town center aggression against 1 town center fast castle, right? Because sometimes you can be very successful with it. For example, you're playing some aggressive civilizations, maybe Rus, maybe Joan of Arc, and you can deny your opponent's gold, or you can deny food sources. But sometimes opponent is so protected and so difficult to attack, or so good at defending, that you'll just be in H2 while your opponent is H3 and you don't have any advantages and you'll just be in a bad spot. So you have to see a specific matchup, specific map, you have to adjust. Yeah. So first of all, one town center fast castle, it is an opening, it's how your strategy might start. I will talk about each one of them, how do you play it, when you play it, weaknesses, and which civilizations are typically playing it. First of all, how do you play one town center fast castle? You try to get to castle as soon as possible, then you just play monks and some units, usually knights, to try to raid, to try to control relics. So I have a little asterisk here, as soon as possible, except for some cases. So for example, when you're playing Malians, you don't want to get fast castle as soon as possible, usually you want to get pit mines, you want to get your cow boom, which is going to slow you down just a little. You also want to get some towers or some units in case you need to protect yourself, so you should try to adjust situationally. Again, it's a strategy, right? Okay, when you play it. Usually you play it if you can get good value from H3. So this is value from relics or from being aggressive. For example, you can play HRE Burgrave to be very aggressive with your man towns, as we have seen previously. Maybe you can play Japanese fast castle because you can get your Yoroshiros. So essentially you have 3 stables for the price of 1. You can make a lot of knights. You also have 3 monks to collect relics. So, or maybe you're playing AoE bits and you can get your 8 villagers, which is a huge value increase. Some weaknesses of this opening is limited economy growth, so you will not have as many villagers as you would have if you played 2 town centers or 3 town centers, so you have to use these advantages to compensate for this. Typical chiefs you can see playing this strategy is Japanese, Ibis or HRE. So this is an example of Japanese fast castle. We can see main breakpoints, feudal, castle, 2 town centers and just in the end imperial. I'm not discussing what happens in Imperial or after for most strategies, I'm just focusing on this stage. So we can see economy is steadily growing, then it gets a boost from relics and from Yoroshiros, then it starts to grow faster after you add a second town center, because at some point you add a second town center after hitting castle, after you collected some relics. We can also see military, you don't want to produce units before castle, then you have Yoroshiro stable, you start to produce a lot of knights, then not so many units maybe, but then you try to transition into infantry composition, so your military growth slows down just a little bit. Your defense boosts by your tower, by your town center, but then it degrades because you run out of food, you run out of gold mine maybe, until you add second town center, maybe at this point you add some more towers and your defense starts to grow again. So to compare, let's look at Malian's fast castle. We can see this sharp economy growth, beginning in feudal age and very sharp spike during castle transition, because you add your Grand Fulani Corral and your cow ranches start to produce a lot more food. So just look at this. It was graph for Japanese, this is for Malians. It's much stronger. Also, maybe you don't get such a sharp increase in military, but you start producing a lot of military units in Castle Age, you can just usually overwhelm Malians. So, I mean, overwhelm Japanese with Malians, which is why Malians versus Japanese usually is a very good matchup for Malians. Defense also, it's a little bit lower for Malians, I would say, because your pit mines are exposed. But you can get some units, you can make maybe some towers, you can just steadily increase it over time. Okay, so second opening is one town center aggression. In this case, you maybe get some eco upgrades like wheelbarrow, like double products. Then you try to make units and just raid your opponent, attack your opponent, tower rush your opponent. Try to deny as much of resource collection as possible, try to kill villagers, try to finish the game. You usually play it if your opponent is vulnerable to aggression or you just need to do damage. For example, it's very often played against Byzantines or against Malians, because these civilizations can be very scary. Some weaknesses are that one town center aggression severely limits your economic growth, so it's even worse than playing one town center fast castle in terms of economy, because you don't get relics, you don't get your stronger units and your economic benefits. And also your opponent can hit h3, in which case it can be very dangerous for you if you don't have a way to deal with knights or with man-at-arms. Usually you play this with Delhi, Jushi, Byzantines or Mongols. Delhi just has an insane feudal unit output, for example. Jushi can try to play for mass Zhuginyu, which used to be very strong. Right now it's good, it still can be played, but it's very situational. So let's see some examples. First of all, Delhi aggression. Yeah, here I add 2 more points, which is sacred sites and village fortresses. As we can see, the economy gets one-time boost from sacred sites. Of course, it can go up and down depending on sacred site control, but usually it just gives you a little bit more economy. Also, if you can survive to village fortresses, you get an ability to produce a lot of villagers, which can be almost as strong as Swabia. But usually it doesn't happen all that often. Military plots, you get a lot of military unit production in feudal age. You keep producing units, eventually it slows down because you run out of food, but usually you can swarm your opponent with units and control the map very well. The last component is defense. Because you're playing daily, you need a lot of food sources, you had to get out on the map and get some food. So your economy becomes a little bit exposed, but if you manage to get to castle age, if you manage to get castles, they are cheaper for you, you can boost your defense by just making a lot of castles, a lot of keeps. Second example would be Byzantine's aggression, which is very strong at the moment. You can see that economic growth is a little better compared to this. Just a little bit, yes. But also you have an insane military output because of mercenaries. After you get mercenary, you get a small military boost, then you get this boost again and again and again. In H3 you get your Golden Horn Tower, which also gives you a lot of mercenaries. And your defense doesn't really degrade, because you build your farms in your base, under your Grand Winery it's called, yeah. So Byzantines, fairly strong, good economic growth. It's a very strong strategy, what can I say. Third opening is 2 town center fast castle. In this case you just make second town center as soon as possible, then you defend it situationally if your opponent's trying to attack, and you try to age up. Usually you play it if you can get away with it, because it's a greedy strategy, it gives you more villagers and also it gives you ability to quickly go castle. However, it's weak if your opponent tries to grab relics first for himself. So if you're playing against HRE, usually it may be weak, because you give HRE access to relics and you put HRE in a very good position, for example. Also, if your opponent is very aggressive and if your town center position is not good, your opponent can just destroy you by being aggressive. You should also watch out for this. Usually you see this played from Rus or from English, because they have strong defensive landmarks, or from Abbasid, because town center transition is just very easy and efficient from Abbasids. So this is an example of, I think, the most hated strategy right now, which is English to town centers. We can see economic output becomes really good after 2 town centers. We can also see that they get a military spike after hitting feudal, because of free king. Then you do not really produce anything until castle, but your king is enough to do some damage and force some response from your opponent. And after hitting castle, you just start producing from white tower, then add maybe some more production, you can put out a lot of units. Also defense, we can see a big spike after hitting castle. This is because of white tower. So this is main reason, I think, why this strategy is so strong, because you cannot immediately punish English for playing naked castle, essentially. Another example would be Abbasid 3 town centers. So it's not exactly 2 town centers, but it's still the same archetype. You can hit castle at about the same time, because of how amazing Abbasid economy is in this case. We can see that there are no free units here, but that you can easily produce a lot of units after hitting castle. And we can also see that defense is a little bit weaker, because you do not have white tower, but overall it's still a good strategy if you don't get punished. because usually you have to make some units here, so there will be some military increase, some economy decrease, so it happens. This is why Abbasid are not as prevalent on ladder as English, because look at this. This and this are very good spikes. Okay, and the last opening I want to talk about is 2 town center aggression. Right now, I think it's not as present as it used to be. So you also make a second town center as soon as possible. Then you try to raid an attack, and you try to age up if your opponent managed to hold off your aggression. So you should not fully commit to this aggression. At least if you cannot do any damage, it might be better to age up. You usually play it if you can get away with it, and if your opponent is vulnerable. So it's almost the same case as with 2 town center fast castle, but also if you can see some damage opportunity, go for it. Just make some knights, for example. It can be weak to opponent's aggression, in case your opponent is making a lot of units and can do some damage in feudal age. So if you're playing against Delhi, for example, maybe you're better off staying on 1 town center, right? And if your opponent ages up, he gets access to more powerful units, to relic collection, so it might be a bad idea to stay in H2 if you cannot do any damage. Mainly you can see this from Rus, French or Joan of Arc, because these are civilizations that can produce knights in feudal age. And if you can produce knights in feudal age, you're not as afraid of your opponent going up, right? Because if you have 10 or 15 knights, you can even counter enemy knights using your own knights, right? So let's see some examples. First of all, French. Here you get some knights before going to town centers usually, which is why this spike is here. Your economy becomes good after 2 town centers, but you can see the problem here. It is that your defense kinda drops because you run out of food sources. You have to go for berries, for deer, for boar maybe. Maybe you have to build some towers, in which case you sacrifice some of your military. Usually you just try to use your knights and your military to protect yourself from enemy raids, to put pressure on your opponent. And if you can get to castle age, it's easy to produce keeps for French players, and they like doing it, so your defense also becomes good. And if you hit Imperial Age, after this it will be big increase because of Red Palace. Red Keep? I think it's Red Keep, yes. Okay. So, also Rus plays this strategy, and Rus is kind of better right now because of Kremlin, because you see how much defense is boosted. And you do not start producing knights usually before second town center, but after you have 2 town centers, you can just go for mass units, mass knights, archers, maybe even spearmen, try to push your opponent. So sometimes it can be good. Instead of playing too fast castle, sometimes it can be good with Rus to just be aggressive in feudal age. Yeah, so here I made a little table, maybe not so little, but still it's a table showing openings for each civilizations. This gives you some sense of how good or how usually, how often is it good to play an opening with a civilization. So you can see this plus means it's good in most games, so you can almost always play it and have no problems. Plus minus is situationally good, so there are situations where it is optimal, there are situations where it is not so good. Minus would be rarely good, so in theory you can play it, right? You can get away with it, but usually you're better off playing another strategy. So you can see some civilizations are more flexible, more universal, like English or Rus, or maybe Jushi. It's not to say that Jushi is very strong, but you can play all these openings with Jushi, so it's fine. Yeah, some are not very flexible. For example, here it is what? Malians. Malians are almost always playing 1 town center fast castle, maybe sometimes aggression, but usually it's 1 town center and get to castle. It's just more optimal for them this way. And Delhi rarely plays 2 town centers, it usually plays 1 town center aggression, sometimes fast castle, in some cases. So yeah, it can be situational, but if you look at these green pluses for each civilization, this is strategy you can almost always play and have little problem. Okay, so one other aspect about strategies is playing endgame, because for now we talked mainly about openings, about how we progress in feudal age, in castle age, but endgame is much more complicated, because there are so many factors. For example, relics, for example, do have access to gold mines or to trade or maybe woodlines. There are some general rules. For example, first you need to have an ability to win or at least not lose a straight fight. It can be Nest of Beasts for Chinese, it can be Network of Castles for English, maybe it can be Keeps for French, in case you have Red Palace, because they are very strong protectively, and you can just try to hide under your keeps. So you need some way of not losing a straight fight and not losing the game on the spot. Second is passive resource generation, and gold, wood or stone is very strong, because it means you will not eat through your resources as quickly, and your economy will just be stronger. So another thing to consider is resource control. It's very important, not only because you will run out of resources, but also because you can deny resources to your opponent. So it's woodlines, gold or stone mines, and maybe neutral markets. So for example, on Gorge, there are two neutral markets, which are near the middle of the map, and often you can try to control both markets, which can be very strong. One consideration is that you need some possibilities to damage your opponent and to prevent damage from him. So in late game it's usually just very intensive raids, raid defenses, some keeps, some towers, some siege pushes. So you need to constantly be thinking how can you damage your opponent, and can your civilization damage your opponent, and in which way, right? So for example, if you're playing Chinese, you might use Fire Lancers or Palace Guards, because they are very quick, they are very good at breaking palisades, at breaking buildings, very powerful. Or if you're playing English, I think often you're better off just trying to push through one specific point, just trying to get a lot of siege, get a lot of units, get network of castles by building towers, and just try to push, because this is where you're strongest. I also made this table for endgame advantages for civilizations. Here I have 4 advantages, which is how strong civilization is in a straight fight, how good of a passive resource generation it has, how good is it at raiding, at defense. So again, this is just my perspective. So for example, maybe you will not agree that AoE are bad at raiding because they have desert traders. But in my opinion, HRE are just better because of good food output, because of strong man-at-arms. So this is kind of subjective, but usually you can see most of these are agreed upon, right? So I don't think anyone will argue that English is very good at straight fights, at defense, at passive resource generation. Maybe it's not the best at raids, but it has a lot of food, so it can afford to send a lot of man-at-arms and horsemen to raid. Yeah, you can also see some civilizations are just not as good at endgame, like Ibis or Delhi, so maybe you should try to avoid playing late game with them. Maybe you should try to finish games in Castle Age or in Feudal Age. Some civilizations feel very comfortable, like Chinese, like English, even French are not that bad. Rus is okay, Rus is good. So yeah, you just need to keep it in mind when you're playing Castle Age and when you're playing Endgame. So when you're playing Castle Age, for example, you can try to avoid some kinds of endgame, or try to set up yourself for a good position. So in general, to summarize, how do you choose your strategy? Usually you do it in the first 3 minutes of the game, because you can see how resources are distributed, you can see matchups, so what map you're playing, against what civilization you're playing. You just choose your opening, what you're going to go for. You think about your and your opponent's key transition points, so at what points can you attack? When do you need to defend? And you generally want to aim to attack or to defend or to do some other actions at these specific time intervals. And you try to think about endgame if you cannot finish the game on the spot. You try to improve your position by taking map control, by placing defensive keeps maybe on some resources, by denying neutral markets, or you just try to avoid it altogether. Maybe you try to force a win condition through sacred sites, or just try to push your opponent to all in with, I don't know, mass siege in Castle Age. Yeah, so this is usually how you think about strategy. Okay, let's continue by discussing tactics. So, we have already discussed strategies, and strategies give us a way of playing the game in general. So if you have a strategy, you follow it, you know what actions in general you're supposed to do at what stages of the game, at which stages of the game. Tactics are much more situational, and tactics are for in-moment adjustments. So it's a specific set of actions that you do depending on your situation. I have decided to divide them into these three archetypes. Yeah, also a lot of tactics can accomplish a similar goals. For example, if you want to counter enemy king or enemy knights, you can go with spearmen, towers and palisades, or everything together. So each one of these is a valid tactic. So yeah, three archetypes I'm discussing here is economic tactics. These are tactics that are aimed at developing your economy. Military tactics, which are simply how do you counter your opponent and what you try to do to damage him. And defensive tactics, it is how you protect yourself from raids, from damage, and how you make your resource collection more safe, right? So let's try to go through each one of these. I will be presenting some examples of tactics for each one of these. I will try to cover all the main tactics that people are using. I will also be using some examples from real games, screenshots on the right side. So for example, economic tactic number 1, it's fairly basic, it is deer, boar or berry collection. For each tactic I'm going to say how do you use it, when do you use it in general, and what weaknesses does it have. So we can see here Mongol player, he placed a gear, placed a tower, and 5 villagers are collecting deer pack. If he needs to get villagers to safety, he can put them inside this tower, because it holds exactly 5 villagers. You can also get 10, maybe 15 villagers, maybe more towers, so these examples are just illustrations. Okay, so how to use it? Just place some defenses, towers of palisades, and start gathering. When do you use it? You use it when you have some sources like deer or boar or berries which are efficient for you and are easy to get, and when you would not rather make farms, right? So if you're playing English or Byzantines or HRE, it's often better for you to just make farms in your base, because it's much safer and it's quicker and it's more efficient. And some weaknesses of this approach is that you can get raided, maybe you can even get preventively raided, right? If your opponent places a knight or maybe 2 knights at this deer pack, you go here with your villagers and you get the knight. You waste a lot of idle time, you lose a villager, so it's kinda bad. Also, if your opponent is doing a heavy aggression approach, for example, like 20-30 archers with some rams, with some cavalry or spearmen, then this deer pack you will not be able to collect it, because your opponent will just push you from it, and you're better off going for safer resources or for farms. Yeah, so second tactic is just going farms. By the way, these are not mutually exclusive. You can go for deer pack and you can also make some farms at home, protected. Like if you're playing Mongols, maybe you can place 2 pastures at your town center and also go for deer at the same time. So, how do you do farm transition? You make farms and you try to make them in a secure location. So these farms under town center are secure. These farms in general are also okay, maybe not so protected, but it's fine, under Aachen Chapel. And you should not, I think in most cases, try to add a lot of farms at the same time. So if you have to place 20 farms in the same time, usually it would be better to distribute them across different timestamps. So you can start by adding 1 or 2 farms per minute, because it's more efficient, because you can more efficiently control villagers, so your villagers will not be running in circles building all farms, right? You can use 1 villager for 1 farm. So when do you go for farms? Usually you go for farms when you're out of good food sources. So for example, deer pack is a good food source for almost any civilization. Berries might be bad for HRE, might be bad for English, I don't know, for essentially non-berry gathering civs. So usually with them, sometimes you can ignore berries and go for farms, straight for farms. Yeah, and weaknesses are just opponent using these resources to do something else, because each farm costs 75 wood, it's quite a lot. Your opponent might go second town center or age up or just be very aggressive instead. So this is what you have to consider, and you have to go farms only if your farms are really good and will pay for itself really quickly, or you have no other choice. Okay, so economic tactic number 3 is essential eco upgrades. These are the big ones: wheelbarrow, survival techniques, and tithe bears. So these are very strong. Wheelbarrow very strong because it boosts your economy and it gives your villagers more survivability. Survival techniques is just very cheap and very good. And tithe bears just give you a lot of passive resource generation out of thin air, right? So wheelbarrow usually you want to get as soon as possible, except if you're going for town center or a fast castle, then you want to get wheelbarrow after this. Survival techniques you get as soon as you get on deer or boar, because it's very cheap. And tithe bars you usually get if you have at least 2 relics and you have some spare gold, because often maybe you need this 500 gold for some units in the moment. So weaknesses don't really apply here because these are amazing technologies, they pay for themselves really quickly. Economic tactic number 4 is also economic upgrades, but these are collection upgrades. They are a bit more situational and they sometimes can be expensive, so usually you go them also after second town center or fast castle, and if you have enough villagers on resources. So my rule of thumb would be, if you have at least 10 villagers, it's worth getting this. And you have maybe sometimes to get them preventively. For example, you're soon to go castle and you're only collecting wood with 3 villagers right now, but you know that in 1 minute you will start collecting wood with 10 or 15, so you can get this preventively. Yeah, and weaknesses don't really apply also because these are not so expensive, right? Because if you have 10 plus villagers, this will pay for itself in from 2 to 4, maybe 5 minutes, so it's really fine. Yeah, so sort of economic tactic number 5 is relic and sacred site collection. So these are strong, relics and sacred sites, because they give you some extra generation of gold, and relics are amazing for Imperial, for late game, so this is one of the ways you secure yourself advantage in the future. How do you do it? You just send your monks, right, in H3. You also use your knights or other units to basically protect your monks, maybe to distract your opponent, to raid his base, to get his attention of this. Yeah, you also can use palisades if you need to maybe wall sacred sites or wall relics, so sometimes you can in H2 place triangle palisades like this around the relic, and then you can grab it in H3 and deny it to your opponent. Yeah, so you want to do this basically every time you go H3, except for cases when you really need to mass your military in the moment. For example, if you're playing H3 Burgrave Rush, you cannot afford it, you need to make man at arms, you need to rush to try to finish the game. Or when you're getting heavily raided or all-in by your opponent, then you also need to just produce units, just produce defenses, try to survive. So this is countered, this is weak to opponent raids and extensive aggression, so extensive aggression is kinda clear, it will not help you if you are getting destroyed at your base. And raids, because you divert your forces, because you have to build this, if you don't have enough defenses, you can get easily raided, so getting 1 relic and losing 10 villagers usually is not worth it. Okay, so tactic number 6 is trade. You just make a few markets, you want to make them as far away from a neutral market as possible, but in a safe location. So if you can place it in the middle of the map, or maybe in opponent's corner, it's not worth it obviously. You start making traders. So you want to use this if you expect to be out of gold soon, so you want to create some gold generation for yourself. You have a safe market, so it is an option, right? And you need gold, because sometimes you just don't need gold. For example, if you have a lot of passive gold generation or relics, maybe you don't need it. Also, your trade might be really good if you're playing Mongols or Abbasids, and you can just go it even if you have enough gold. But you can just still go trade because it's very efficient. So this is weak to opponent trades, to heavy aggression, because each trader costs I think 120 resources, so this is like 1 crossbowman or 1 man at arms. Imagine you build this, I don't know how many traders are here, but let's assume 15 traders, when you could have gotten 15 crossbows instead. It would be better for defense or for aggression, right? So you have to bide your time. Also, your opponent can try to disrupt your trade route, for example, to place a palisade, place a tower, or keeps near neutral markets, right? So have to watch out for this also. As here we can see a tower and a stone wall to protect this trade. So usually that's what you have to do. Tactic number 7 is buying or selling at market. It's a huge one, it can be very impactful. So you just need to make a market, and how it works, you sell some resources to get gold, or vice versa. You buy some resources using gold. So gold is your medium. When you use it is several cases. First of all, you're cut off from some resource. For example, you don't have any more gold or any more wood on the map, or you're getting crushed in feudal age and you just need some gold. You can use market. It's sometimes it's a good option. You have to be open-minded about this. It's only 100 food. Okay, so maybe you have a lot of resources you can spend. It's often the case in late games with food. Often you have thousands and thousands of food, and you just want to exchange it for gold. Maybe you just need to quickly rebalance your eco, because sometimes, for some reason, your eco is imbalanced. You have a lot of... you need, for example, gold, and you have 5000 wood, but you don't have any gold, and you want to go Imperial. Just sell some food, it's okay. You will lose maybe 300-400 food total, but you'll go Imperial, you'll be in a good position. So weaknesses, I would say there is only one weakness to this, is opponent also using markets to pump or dump exchange rates. So for example, it's actually it occurs quite often when you both are Imperial Age and you both have markets, and your opponent sells food before you do. So where he sells food, it's like 70 gold per 100 food. It's a very good exchange rate. Then he trades a bunch and he drops this exchange rate, so you get only 10 gold for 100 food. It's much worse for you, so sometimes you have to be proactive with this. Sometimes you can also do this, and you need to keep an eye for it, essentially. Okay, so let's move on to military tactics. First is just making production buildings. So you want to make your production buildings in a safe place, so they cannot be easily broken or denied, but also you don't want to make them too far away from where the action is going to be. In this case we can see a keep and a lot of barracks under this keep, so this keep is near base, probably close, sufficiently close to the center of the map, but also these barracks are protected by this keep, so I would say this is a good location for production. When you use it, when you need to produce units more quickly than you currently can. So what it means is, for example, if you are producing 3 or 4 units at the same time per each barrack, if you have resources to do this, you probably don't have enough production. You need to make more production buildings. Yeah, in feudal age, usually it's about 2, maybe 3 production buildings, maybe 4 production buildings per unit type. In later stages of the game, it's 6, 7, 8, maybe 10, maybe 15, so you have to adjust based on your current situation. So only weakness I would say is that production buildings cost quite a lot, 150 per usual production building, so you have to carefully adjust amount of production buildings. It's very easy to make too many of them instead of making farms or instead of making units, and you can just lose the game because of this. Second tactic is getting military upgrades. For this you need blacksmith or university, so it's not like eco upgrades, which are easier to get. Sometimes you can get 2 blacksmith or 2 universities just to get multiple upgrades at the same time. For example, Daily does this very often, but Daily is a special case. So you use it when you have enough units and the tax will make some impact. Or if your opponent, for example, has 20 archers. So I'm using the archers example because it's the most important one. If you have a lot of archers and your opponent has a lot of archers, 15, maybe 20 plus, then you need your arrow attack upgrade and arrow defense upgrades from blacksmith. Because it's very important, your archers, for example, will damage knights for 3 damage instead of 2 damage, or for 2 damage instead of 1 damage. So this is a big increase. Only weakness I would say is high cost, because you not only have to get these upgrades, you also have to make blacksmith, make universities. They can be quite expensive, so you only want to do this if you already have enough units. Okay, so tactic number 3 is feudal push. You can see 2 examples here. First example, some archer push with rams against opponent that tried to fast castle. Second is just pushing Malians. big army for Malians, big army for Delhi, no Rams yet. So how do you push in feudal? Usually you just make your strong units. Almost always you have to make some form of ranged units, archers or Juginu or maybe longbows or javelin throwers. Also you make rams if you have something to break and if you have military advantage, and you try to aim for enemy resources and for production, because if you can destroy this, you will inflict heavy damage on opponent. Also you try to snipe villagers, but often you aim for resources and for production. You do this if you want and can to inflict damage in feudal age. So for example, here opponent rushing castle age and having an exposed gold, it's a good damage opportunity, right? Especially for Delhi. And here you're just playing against Malians, so Delhi needs to do damage against Malians, and it can do this very well, so you have no option but to attack. Weaknesses would be that it is very expensive, it is very all-in, because you spend your economy instead of developing, instead of going age up, you spend it on military, so you need to do some damage. And also your opponent can try to raid you. If, for example, here this Abbasid opponent goes for knights and goes for your economy, it can be difficult to protect it. You need to spend resources and this will weaken your push. Also, it is possible to cut off reinforcements in case you're only making archers. Like 8, maybe 5 horsemen can intercept a lot of archers, so you have to be aware about this. Number 4 is Tower Rush. You can see 2 examples here. This is a classic Mongol Tower Rush on berries and on gold. Very strong, very good position. And this is also a very good Tower Rush with 5 villagers from Rus on opponent's Aachen Chapel. Also very annoying to deal with. So how do you use it? You identify good Tower Rush spots. So this spot is good because it blocks 2 resources. This is good because it's, look, just insane, it blocks Aachen, it blocks this wood line. You also bring as many villagers as you need, and maybe units to protect. So here Mongol only needs 1 villager and 2 spearmen to protect, to break this, to ignite this, to get bounty. And here Rus player brings 5 villagers, which might seem like quite a lot, but you need this, so H3 player cannot stop your tower from going up. Yeah, so you do this until it's too late, because if this tower is late, H3 will have spearmen, archers, and this is just a good game if you cannot build it, essentially, you just lose villagers. So Mongols can do it pretty much every game, because they go spearmen, they go tower rush at minute 2, it's impossible to stop. So yeah, when you need to do damage and when you can do this, it can be very strong. Weaknesses would be high cost, because it's not cheap, going with 5 villagers or going even with 1 and making spearmen, so it needs to do something, it cannot be just a useless tower. Also, a villager or military pools can counter it, so it's very situational, you need to be aware of your opponent's options. Also, opponent can try to change resources, for example go to another gold, but for example you cannot go to another Aachen, right? This is why this tower is so good. Number 5 is early raids. You just make some cavalry, for example knights or Ghazi raiders or horsemen, or even maybe archers, maybe javelin throwers. And you send them so they are not detected to raid some exposed resource. In this example it's berries, and micro here is not ideal, but you see some villager kills, some villager kills will come through, and this not only causes villager kills, but also idle time. You should also try to not lose units, because at early stages of the game, like feudal age, maybe even early castle, it's very important to get military advantage, so you cannot be losing them in most cases. So you try to raid whenever possible, because raiding is extremely strong in this game, because of kills, because of idle time, and if you're not trying to rush another objective. So if you're Rus trying to get second town center, or if you're trying to go to castle as HRE, usually you want to wait until you completed these objectives, and only then you can start raiding. This is weak to counter raids, so you spend some resources to get these knights going, maybe some production, and this gives your opponent an opportunity to raid you, especially if you're playing French, your food most likely is exposed, so you should watch out for this. Usually it's a game of raids and counter raids. Also palisades, towers and defensive units, so static defenses and spearmen also can deal with this. And defensive units are very strong, because if you lose these knights, it becomes a very bad situation for you. You give your opponent a huge opportunity for counter-attack. Yeah, so also we have late raids. Late raids usually at castle, late castle, Imperial Age. So here you send a bigger mass of units, they can be whatever, they can be horsemen, knights, camel archers, maybe men-at-arms. You send them to opponent's economy and you try to inflict as much damage as possible, and divert as much attention as possible. So at this point it's usually not about saving these units, it's about causing a maximum amount of destruction and maximum amount of diversion. So you use this also whenever possible, because raids are insane in this game. And when you don't need all of your units right now. So for example, your opponent might be get ready to push you with the 70 or 80 military supply, in which case you cannot afford this, because sure you will kill some villagers, but you will just lose your base, you will lose your game. So you need to be aware of this. Weaknesses would be static defenses, in case keeps. At this point usually opponent will have keeps. In case of HRE, maybe some towers with emplacements, some stone walls, palisades, or forced push from opponent. Yeah, so you can lose your game if you lose these units and you aren't sufficiently protected from opponent's counter push. Okay, so tactic number 7 is buying time in field versus castle. So it's often the case that you tried feudal aggression, but you weren't able to finish the game on the spot, and now you need to go castle yourself, because your opponent is already castle. In this case, you don't want to send all your units to your base, usually, because your opponent can just push you and you will die. Instead, you need to try to run around opponent's base, try to inflict some damage, some idle time, kill some villagers. Yeah, and try not to lose units. Also, at the same time, you want to get to H3. So yeah, we already described when we use this. But usually, if you can continue aggression in H2, for example, if you can get a lot of Geyser Raiders, or if your opponent doesn't have an overwhelming mass, you want to continue aggression in H2. So only go H3 if you are sure it's the best option. Weaknesses would be static defenses, for example some palisades, some towers, maybe even a keep. It would make it impossible for you to inflict damage in many cases. And cavalry. If your opponent plays knights or even horsemen, you will not be able to run around with your units, your archers for example, as much, and your opponent can raid you very easily. So you have to be very optimal, very economic about this. You have to go castle as quickly as possible, while buying as much time as possible. Okay, number 8 is Knight or MAA, so Man-at-Arms Swarm. This is basically armored unit swarm. Here we can see a lot of Keshiks running around at the Japanese base, causing a lot of damage, basically securing the game. So you just go H3 and get a lot of armored units, and just attack. So you use this when your opponent isn't ready. In this example, Japanese player tried to play feudal aggression, and he's still H2, so he isn't ready to defend this. Or if you're fighting for relics, you just make a lot of knights, right? It is difficult to counter them, so usually your opponent should also make knights, because they're quick, they're strong. This strategy can be weak to crossbowmen, so if you're going for an armored unit like Man-at-Arms or Knight Timing, if your opponent has a lot of crossbowmen, or even spearmen, then he can defend this, and you will lose your army and he will be stronger. Also, strong static defenses can ward this off, for example White Tower or Kremlin sometimes, and this is why White Tower is so insane. And if your opponent manages to successfully defend, you just wasted a bunch of resources and save food to make these units. So you have to inflict some damage, you have to do this only when it's justified. For example, if you're fighting for relics, usually knights are almost always justified, right? But making Man-at-Arms or a lot of Keshiks and running here inside the base, it's situational. You have to watch out for this and you have to know where you can do this. Number 9 is just a composition, so Man-at-Arms plus Spearman plus Crossbow. Here we can see a lot of Man-at-Arms, some Crossbow and Springles. So you have to adjust this proportion depending on situation. Usually it's more Crossbows, a little bit less of Man-at-Arms, maybe some Spearmen to counter cavalry. And this composition is good because it's very universal. So you can do it in most games, in H3, when you just want to fight, when you maybe not playing a very long H3. But even in a long H3 it also works. because crossbowmen kill almost any unit, and their only real weakness is getting swarmed by melee units, or maybe mangonels, in which case you make man-at-arms or spearmen to act as frontline and springles to counter siege. So what are weaknesses of this composition? It is raids, because as you can see this is a very slow army. It is difficult to use it to defend from raids. Also a siege blob, we'll talk about this later, but if your opponent has 3 mangonels, for example, and some springles, this will not be so great against it. And static defenses like keeps or towers or even town centers, it's very difficult to push with crossbows. Okay, number 10 is mass hand cannoneers. This is an extension of previous strategy, it's just an imperial stronger version of it. You just do the same, but this time you go for hand cannoneers, and it's much more expensive, so you need to have a lot of gold to do this. And weaknesses here would be the same as previous tactic, but also you should avoid getting surrounded, because hand cannoneers are really expensive. You don't want to lose them, so you should try not to get surrounded by horsemen, or even by man-at-arms or spearmen. Number 11 is mass melee units. It's another popular composition. Here are 2 most popular cases. First is knights plus spearmen. Here also some man-at-arms, but usually it's knights plus spearmen, which you use to fight for relics and to raid at early castle age. Second is man-at-arms plus horsemen, which you use more in late game, with HRE especially, because your man-at-arms are good against other man-at-arms. So these compositions both allow you to raid efficiently, allow you to fight early, allow you to be very mobile, to surround opponent, to counter siege. But some specifics are that you need a lot of food to do this, because these units, melee units in general, are just very food intensive. And also it gets countered by man-at-arms spearmen plus crossbows, or hand cannoneers. So in a straight fight it often will lose, but if you can surround, if you can raid, outmaneuver, it can be very good. Okay, number 12 is siege blob plus frontline. Here you can see 3 mangonels, 2 culverins, well, 1 culverin, but second one is in the back, and some frontline units, spearmen. So you can make such composition. You can also add some trebuchets or bombards to break buildings. You want to do this if you're currently safe from raids or surrounds, so you know this won't immediately get surrounded and you won't get raided, right? You will not need to bring all your units back. And you use this composition when you want to push and when you want to win fights, because this is the ultimate fighting composition basically. Maybe some hand cannoneers also, but mass siege blob in a straight fight with some frontline, it's the only way to reliably push in this game, I would say. Okay, and this is weak to raid surrounds, already talked about it. So if you see your opponent going for this, you can try to raid with mass horsemen, rams, man-at-arms. Just try to divert attention, try to place some static defenses. Yeah, also springle blob plus static defenses, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. You just place a keep, some towers, and you use a lot of springles or culverins to break this siege ball. This is what usually games degrade into in very late scenarios, like 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes. It's all about raids and the siege blobs and static defenses. Number 13 is redoubt keeps and towers. You can see here a keep protecting a gold mine, also some protection underneath and a tower, and here we can see just a tower near hidden forest to give some vision. So you place them at key locations when you need some control, some vision, some protection maybe also. So you can use this to push into opponent's territory, into opponent's base from this. It's very easy. If you get counter pushed, you can just step back here and defend it for a while. So this is a good safe redoubt from which you can attack, which you can also protect. And a resource hub. Some weaknesses would be siege push, because this is quite expensive. Yeah, high cost is also a vulnerability, because your opponent can just use siege, use rams, use trebuchets to break this. So if you lose this, you just lost resources you invested into it, and it might not be easy to get 900 extra stone. So you have to be careful about these buildings. Number 14 is resource denying towers, keeps or walls. So context here is pink players collecting wood, but he is soon to be out of wood, so a purple player placed this tower and this keep, which will deny this wood from being collected. So this can be really strong, you just need to send your villagers to construct it into opponent's territory or near it. And this is a good way to finish the game, because one of the ways to finish the game, because your opponent will be struggling for resource. It will be a massive advantage for you, because they will have to buy some wood maybe, yeah, or just not produce anything wood related. So siege. Okay, and usually place it on resources that your opponent is about to collect, but if you see unprotected woodline like this, maybe you should even place tower here, maybe your opponent will not react to it, you can deny active woodline, maybe tower here. So yeah, you have a lot of flexibility here. You do this only when you have spare resources, because if you need to fight, you should fight, and if you suspect your opponent will run out of resources soon, because imagine your opponent has a lot more woodlines on his side of the map, all of which are protected, then you don't want to do this, you want to be more aggressive, more active in the moment. But if resources become scarce and you can do this and you have a lot of free resources already, then you can do this. You should also be careful about your villagers, because while they're constructing keeps and towers like this, they are exposed. Okay, now let's move on to defensive tactics. First defensive tactics is defensive spearmen or some units. So you just make them when towers or palisades are not a good option. In this case, for example, Malian player usually wouldn't want to place a tower here, because this mine will not be worked by any villagers, so tower will just stand without anyone inside. Palisades may be not the best option, so you just make spearmen, they can ward off any geyser raiders. You use it when you cannot use static defenses and when you want to push at some point, because you cannot use your palisades or towers to push, but if you know you want to push soon, maybe with Malians, yeah, or you will need just units to defend, you're better off just making some spearmen. Weakness would be high cost, because you have to make production, you have to make units, so if you're playing HRE and going Castle Age, maybe you don't want to go barracks, you should just drop a tower on gold and maybe 2 towers, and it'll be enough. But in many cases, Malians are the most stereotypical example, you want to go units. Number 2 is defensive towers, already talked about this, but just some considerations. These towers have emergency repair, which is very strong for HRE. Also here you can see placement, you can collect some stone for a placement, and it will be much stronger defensively. So you want to place towers if you need vision, and if you want, these towers can provide you protection. So for example, this tower can provide you protection for this gold, because it's exactly 5 villagers and emergency repairs, so it will buy you a lot of time during the first 8 minutes of the game. Then of course you'll need some units. Weaknesses would be rams and archers, because your opponent can maybe make a ram, place 15 archers inside, try to ram it. If you try to break a ram, kill your villagers. So these are some weaknesses. A large amount of cavalry also, if this tower is more exposed, or if it's on deer packs for example, it just can get surrounded by geyser raiders, by knights, by horsemen, get destroyed, so have to watch out for this. Number 3 is defensive palisades or walls. At this example we can see both players are using them. These palisades are securing this whole region for the blue player, because the only way to go to his base is through here, and it is protected by units. Also yellow player is using palisades to defend sacred sites. I wouldn't say it's purely defensive, they are more like map control, but anyway, these palisades are quite cheap. He can construct it with his units because he's playing daily Sultanate and protect the sacred sites. So you always want to minimize total size of your palisades. This palisade is very good because it's adjacent to woodline. This is maybe not so cheap, but this is necessary in this case. So when you need to secure a region, you want to place palisades like this. It's fine. It gives you so much protection, so much time. Weaknesses would be sometimes high cost, so this is kind of expensive. If you wanted to place palisade like this, it will be even more expensive, or a stone wall maybe. So maybe you want to spend your resources on developing economy or on military units, so you have to adjust situationally. And extensive raids are able to break these palisades. So for example 20 geyser raiders will break through this in no time. but still it's at least some protection. So I think you should be very proactive with your palisades or your walls to control the map. You just need to be careful about your resources. Number 4 is layered walls or palisades. It's when one layer just is not enough and when you have a lot of resources to consolidate. You can place it all over the map, or you can place it near your base, but you need even more resources for this. And a good way to counter this are proactive towers or keeps. Imagine placing tower here or tower here, then breaking this wall. A purple player would not be able to revolve this or this easily, because it would be required to break these towers or these keeps. So if you want to counter this, try placing tower or keeps. Maybe you can try even to break stone wall and place palisade so it cannot be rebuilt. Okay, tactic number 5 is defensive keep. I refer to keeps that are being built inside your base or near your base, like this. This particular keep it benefits because it's HRE from emergency repairs. It protects woodline, it protects tier pack, and also some production is being placed underneath it. So just a good position. However, you should only place it if you are getting very strongly pushed or raided. Sometimes you can even place it on your farms, but usually you want to make keep more proactively to control some external resource, for example big gold mine, or just create a good point for attacking your opponent. So you should only do this if you cannot manage with your military, if simple palisades or towers are not enough, and you really want to secure your position. For HRE, for example, it's a very good choice because of you can place relic inside, you have emergency repairs, and you want to go Imperial with not a lot of units most of the time. Weaknesses would be high cost and siege, because siege will break through this eventually. Number 6 is defensive mangonel. It's a specific use case for when you're getting pushed with a lot of archers or crossbows. So archers and crossbows may be difficult to kill if you don't have enough units. So maybe you should drop a siege workshop, or if you're playing Abbasid or Ayyubids, just make mangonel with your units. So it's very good for defending from mass ranged units. Only weakness I would say is springles or melee units, 2 weaknesses. So you have to have some sort of front line, or maybe palisades or defenses, or repair with your villagers to prevent with this mangonel from being broken. But if it's not broken, it's very strong. You can also try to hide it between buildings, also works very well. And our last defensive tactic is textiles. It's very underappreciated, I think. Basically you just need to click it in your town center. So it can be strong if you expect to be raided and you don't have extensive raid protection, so maybe you don't have towers everywhere and not a lot of palisades, and you think at some point you lose some villager. But weakness is that you sacrifice one villager to get this, because you research it instead of producing a villager. So it's situational, but if you don't want to spend a lot of resources on raid protection and you know your opponent will raid you, I would suggest getting it. Okay, so we have discussed different strategies and tactics, and now I just want to conclude by showing this list of questions. So you can use this list to understand if you lost the game or if you won the game and trying to improve. First of all, you have to think about your strategy. Does your strategy make sense for your current map and matchup? So for example, maybe you played too greedily, like 3 town center English, and you just couldn't defend yourself from opponent's aggression. Or you played too aggressively with 1 town center Rus and you just couldn't push your opponent, and this is why you lost. So if your strategy was wrong or weak, then it was very hard for you to win since the beginning, and I think you should think more about strategy and just not try to improve tactics for this current game you're analyzing, because it was very difficult for you from the start. Second, if you think your strategy is good, then you need to understand if you know enough tactics. So maybe you do not know how to react when your opponent is using knights. Maybe you don't know what to do when opponent is playing 4 town centers or Russian Imperial, or going for relics. So you need to learn more tactics, you need to know what options do you have, so you have something to choose from. Now, if you know a lot of tactics, you just need to understand which tactics are right for your current situation. So should, for example, you try to counter his relic collection with horse archers, or maybe with spearmen, or you should use your palisades to wall relics in, or you should just go for his base and ignore relics. So these all are options, and depending on situation, each one of them may be the best option. Then, if you already know enough tactics, if you're using them at the right time, maybe your execution isn't as good. For example, you try to counter raid with knights, but you're just not good at counter raiding, you do it at wrong moments, or you attack wrong resources, maybe you're raiding with wrong units, so you have to also check out your execution. So how well do you execute each tactic, how well do you know what to do. And finally, if you think your strategy makes total sense, so it should be strong. If you think your tactics, you know a lot of tactics, you apply them correctly and at the right time, maybe you just need to improve mechanically, because some games you just lose not because of your strategy and tactics, but because your opponent was microing a little bit better and his economy was a little bit more optimized. Yeah, so I would suggest answering these questions. Yeah, and I think this is all for this guide. If you have any remaining questions for tactics, for strategy, you can ask them in the comments, here or maybe on Twitch chat. Yeah, but this is all for this guide. Thanks for watching.